Hi, Mr. Gordon. Good afternoon. Can you start by introducing yourself?
Yeah, I'm Gordon Chang. I'm a writer and I look at US-China relations, among other things.
Thank you for introducing yourself. So my first topic, I'm just going to steer away from the video for a moment, is China and the US act as their own self-interests. So what do you think President Biden's goal should be as he's completing his term?
I believe that President Biden should be trying to protect the United States. Now, he is trying to establish these communication channels with China, but I think that his policies are undercutting American goals. So, for instance, we have sent four senior American officials to China, starting with Secretary of State Blinken's trip in June. Then we had the Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, Climate Czar John Kerry, and most recently, Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo. Now, President Biden, I think, believes that by doing that, we can talk to China, and if we can talk to China, things will be okay. But unfortunately, I think that he's undercutting himself. And the reason is that I believe that by sending four senior officials to the Chinese capital without a return visit by a senior Chinese official, he is giving Xi Jinping the idea that Biden himself believes that the United States is in a inferior position, is a supplicant. Now, I'm not saying that Biden feels that way, but I think Xi Jinping believes that Biden feels that way because Biden is not insisting on a return visits. So I think it's making China even more resistant, much more difficult to deal with, much more aggressive, and therefore ultimately undermining Biden's goals.
I agree. Thank you for your feedback. So, second question is, the conflict between the US and China over Taiwan is inevitable. So Biden's administration has shown more discipline in its approach lately. So what is your opinion about that?
Well, President Biden is continuing traditional American policy with regard to Taiwan. And this is the policy of strategic ambiguity, where we tell neither Beijing nor Taipei what we would do in the case of a conflict. Now, a strategic ambiguity worked in a benign period, but the period is now that we're living in is no longer benign. And so I believe that we should be moving to strategic clarity. In other words, telling China that we will defend Taiwan. Right now, I understand people will say that's dangerous, but the point is, through misguided American policies over the last 3 decades, every course going forward for the United States is dangerous. Xi Jinping is an aggressor. He's made it very clear what he intends to do. He's preparing China for war. And so I believe that we need to prepare to defend ourselves, our friends and allies. And that includes, of course, Taiwan.
Okay, so my next question is, the best case scenario for the future of US and China leadership depends on this generation of leaders. Do you agree? And tell me why you agree.
Well, Xi Jinping and the Communist Party, I think, are out to destroy the United States. In May 2019, People's Daily, which is the most authoritative publication in China, carried a piece that declared a people's war on America. People's war is a phrase which has great meaning for the Communist Party. We're Americans, and so we think that we're entitled to be oblivious to what our enemies say of us. But Xi Jinping is serious. And so, although we don't want to think of it this way, we think that we get along with everybody. I don't believe that China believes it can get along with the United States. So this is an existential crisis, which means that, there's only going to be one survivor. It's either going to be the People's Republic of China or the United States of America. We don't want to think that, but that's the way the Chinese view it. So we've got to view it in the same terms.
Okay, China is a major trading partner for the United States, but it's also developing its military capabilities. So what do you think the challenges would be for us if the issue doesn't come to an end?
Well, Xi Jinping is preparing for war, and it's not only the fastest military buildup since the Second World War. He's also trying to sanction-proof his regime. He's stockpiling commodities. He is surveying the United States for nuclear weapons strikes. He is also preparing China's civilians for war, mobilizing China's civilian society. He has purged the Chinese military of officers who are opposed to going to war. And he talks about war all the time. That's not to say that he will go to war, but it is to say that we have to take him at his word. President Biden doesn't believe that we're going to war. The 4 stars in the Pentagon also do not have a sense of urgency. And so we could very well be taken by surprise. So I think that the number one priority with regard to China is to prepare to defend ourselves, our friends, and our allies. And as much as we don't want to do that, as much as we don't want to think about the horrible possibilities, we got to remember we're living in a world where war is spreading. This is not just Ukraine and Eastern Europe. China and Russia are fueling insurgencies in North Africa that look like wars. And if there's a war in East Asia, then I can say that we are in World War III. So right now, this is not a situation where the Americans want to think about it. But when we see war spread from Europe to Africa, it's a possibility that it's going to spread to Asia as well.
Thank you. Excuse me. So what should be the goals for US?
The US goal should be survival. Now, we're Americans, and so we don't think in those terms, but China is out to destroy the United States. It has talked about this. In China right now, permitted discourse includes the extermination of Americans. And so we have to, and people can't say that unless it's approved by the Communist Party. So we have to realize that this crisis is existential and it is urgent. We did not pay attention to Osama bin Laden, even after he killed 6 Americans by bombing the North Tower of the World Trade Center in 1993. It was only after one day, 9/11, where he killed 2,977 Americans, did we bother to pay attention to this. China is much more powerful than Osama bin Laden. And Xi Jinping, in one strike, can kill tens of millions, perhaps hundreds of millions of Americans. He's been threatening to use his nuclear weapons. He talks about it. His regime talks about it. And the purge of the rocket force, which is the branch of the Chinese military that controls almost all of China's nuclear weapons, is ominous because it looks like he's getting rid of officers who are opposed to going to war, which means that he probably wants those officers to push the button if he gives them the order to do so. I think that he's taking his cue from Vladimir Putin, who has preemptively threatened, who's threatened the use of preemptive use of nuclear weapons. Xi Jinping has done that as well. We're not paying attention.
Okay. So what do you feel China owes us?
Well, China, as a member of the international community, has an obligation to adhere to the laws, guidelines, norms, treaties, and to treat other countries fairly. That's its obligation. And that's the obligation of every other country in the international system. China, unfortunately, is not adhering to its obligations. It has made it clear that it's not competing with us in the international system, which was been in place since 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia. It's trying to overthrow that system. We hear Xi Jinping and his officials talk about Tianxia, which is the notion of all under heaven. That Chinese emperors believed that they not only had the right to rule all under heaven, but they also had the obligation to do so. And that means that he views the United States like he views every other country as a vassal, as subordinate to a grand Chinese state. And so we have to understand that he's not competing with us in the Westphalian system. He's trying to overthrow it altogether and replace it with worldwide Chinese rule. To Americans, that sounds ludicrous, But we got to remember that since 2017, Chinese officials have been talking about the moon and Mars should be sovereign Chinese territory. This is the most ambitious aggressor in history. This is so far out of the bounds of comprehensions of Americans that we are not listening to what he's saying.
Thank you. So do you have any other feedback about this issue that you believe everyone should be aware of?
We Americans like to think that we can all get along in this world. That's just core to us. The United States, especially after the Second World War, has built an international system. It helped rebuild Europe, helped rebuild Japan. In other words, making competitors to the United States. That's fine because we believe that we're all going to be better if we are all prosperous, if we are all ruled, we all governed democratically. But unfortunately, China just has a very different conception of the world, and we have to understand what the Chinese are saying. We have to, in the first instance, protect Americans, and we've got to defend the international system. And although it would be nice to think that we could get along with China ruled by communists, I don't think that we can. And it's not because we can't, it's because they can't.
So what do you think we should do moving forward to try to resolve the issue?
I think that we need to sever trade, investment, technical cooperation. We should not be enriching a regime that is hostile and is preparing to wage war on the United States. We should not be having a relationship with a regime that is committing genocide and other crimes against humanity. These are the worst atrocities since the Third Reich. And we have an obligation in the 1948 Genocide Convention to prevent and punish acts of genocide. And both the Trump and the Biden State Departments made formal declarations that China is committing genocide. It's obviously clear that they are, and yet we're doing nothing to meet our obligations. If we can't do this, then we don't have a world that we want to live in. If we tolerate the atrocities committed in China, then we are complicit in it. And so it's time for us to recognize that this is not the world we want to live in. A lot of people say, we shouldn't start a Cold War. Well, China's been waging a Cold War, unrestricted warfare in Communist Party terms. And so if we don't defend ourselves, we're going to lose our country.
Okay.